Welcome to the Flyers, Oliver Bonk. The Philadelphia Flyers select defenseman Oliver Bonk, 22nd overall in the 2023 NHL entry draft. Oliver Bonk is a 6'2", listed at 6'2", 176 pounds, which I don't believe. I believe he's probably a little bit heavier than that. But 6'2", 176, a two-way defenseman for the London Knights. That's London, Ontario in the OHL Hockey League. Again, a little bit of a reach as far as rankings. This is a player who started off kind of red hot offensively in the OHL and then saw a decrease in his offensive production. So, you know, his production on paper looks pretty good. 10 goals, 30 assists, 40 points in 67 games, and a plus 17 for the London Knights. Again, nothing outrageous, but pretty good. And again, if you can make certain adjustments to this game, it might be highly effective. It might be a type of player that vastly improves. One thing that people don't ever consider about defensemen, I always see people rushing to take defensemen at the top of the draft. If you really look at majority of the best defensemen around the NHL, they are not taken around the draft. It's some of them, but it's definitely not a signifier. It's not the end-all, be-all type of situation where if you draft a guy at the top of the NHL draft, he's going to be the best defenseman on your team. It's not certain. It's more likely. You can look at some examples, obviously, Heiskanen, Makar, Hedman, right? These are some of the guys I list just from the top. But Danny Briere made the mistake himself in an interview where he said both Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook were taken in the first round of the draft. They were not. Duncan Keith was taken 54. Actually, if you look at Duncan Keith's mold, not that different than a guy like Oliver Bonk. Now, again, I don't want to jump ahead of myself. I like to talk about players in ranges, right? You know, you think about Michkov, you know, bare minimum, it's a top six forward, high ceiling, franchise caliber winger, right? And if you look at somebody like Bonk, you're going to look at anywhere between probably a number 4 defenseman and a number 2 defenseman. I don't think you look at his tools and go, oh, that's going to be a number 1 defenseman. But even if he lands at that number 3 range, again, if he's a complementary top pairing guy, a guy who can play with a top defender and really fit in nicely, a guy like Matt Niskanen really played that role. People like to talk about how he was a number 1 defenseman. He was not a number 1 defenseman. He's never been a number 1 defenseman. He wasn't a number 1 defenseman for Washington. He wasn't a number 1 defenseman for the Penguins. He wasn't a number 1 defenseman for Dallas. And he wasn't a number 1 defenseman for the Flyers. He was the number 2 defenseman here for the Flyers, and he helped complementary to somebody like Provorov. A lot of these defensemen could be really great, and they take a little bit longer to develop. So a guy like Bonk, I really don't expect for you to see kind of the fruits of that pick until probably 23, 24 years old. People might not like that. I don't know how he's going to develop. But what I see is, yes, it's a safer pick, right? There were some guys on the board. Callum Ritchie was one guy I was really interested in. Perreault was still on there, one of the U.S.'s top point producers. There were still guys available to take with a high offensive upside. They had some risk to them, but at worst, they were probably third-line players in the NHL. Now, defensemen are hard to develop. Taking one that's lacking an element, but is really good at everything else, it's not a bad idea at all. I mean, the kid has got great size. He's a right-handed defenseman. He's really good at defense. He's considered a shutdown defenseman, but was able to put up numbers in the OHL. I don't think that'll translate to the NHL. I don't think you're talking about a 50-point defenseman, 60-point defenseman who's playing 25 minutes a night here. But if he's a 30-point defenseman playing 22 minutes a night, that's a good late-round pick. You know, that's a Travis Sanheimer you took at 15, right? So you have to look at this type of pick as, okay, but what will he actually manifest into? Not what will you see in the first 2-3 years. Again, we took Helge Grans, right? This was a late second-round pick. Very similar skill set. I think he's 6'4", he's bigger. But again, some two-way upside. Could be a top 4 defender. That's very similar type of guy he was taken at the end of the first round. This was a little bit higher. I would say maybe Bonk's ceiling's a little bit higher here. I was surprised they went with D. I thought they were going to go with both forwards just because of the forwards available, but I don't think this is a bad pick. Again, Radek Bonk being his father, has an NHL pedigree, and you never know. Somebody like Ethan Sansom, shout out to Ethan, who's going to be playing with the Phantoms this year. That's a guy who was taken late in the draft. He's a right-handed, big-sized defenseman. Slowly got better at offense. Now he looks like he could be an NHL prospect, maybe a number 6, right? This guy's coming in with a higher pedigree. Bonk is coming in with a higher pedigree and better skills. I'm going to need more time to observe him. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions, but it is the right type of defenseman to take in the second round. Another example of that, Shane Gostisbehere was considerably undersized, but had a lot of offensive skill. PK Subban, Jacob Slavin was taken in the 4th round. PK Subban was taken in the 3rd round. You see, a lot of these guys are flawed defensemen. They're flawed. I believe Kimmo Timonen might have been a 2nd-round pick. I could be speaking out of course there. You know, there is your Carlsons, right, that are taken high in the draft, or your John Carlson, who's taken at 19, right? Like that, nobody knew he was going to be what he was. We traded that number 19 pick, I think it was for Steve Eminger for the Washington Capitals. Also, a number 20 pick, he fizzled out as a bottom-pairing defenseman in the league. He never really turned out into be much. It was a terrible trade for the Flyers, right? But the idea is you really want to take a defenseman there with probably some flaw, assuming you can fix it. If you can get his defensive game, he has a really good defensive game. He's a minimum number 4. And then if you can add an offensive game to him, potentially, you know, as his game evolves, you know, maybe he becomes a number 2. You know, that's a ceiling, right? And then you hope for that. And then you're happy with a 3-4 defenseman. And I think that's what the Flyers were going for here. A safer pick, but not a bad pick. I don't really have a problem with it. Without a 2nd-round pick, I do suspect maybe the Flyers will try to move up in the draft. But I think individual on its own, taking a high-powered Michkov at number 7 with, you know, the Russia risk to a no-risk guy who you will probably bring over, who will probably play in the AHL in a couple years, and then come over to the Flyers in about 3-4 years. I think it's a pretty good pick. Maybe a guy who ends up playing with Cam York, maybe a guy who just fits in, maybe a guy they end up trading in the end. I don't know, but I suspect that they took this kid. They see a higher upside. So I'm really interested to see what happens. And a lot of times these guys can find their offensive game suddenly post-draft year. That can be somewhat of an illusion sometimes just because they're getting older, they're getting better, and those numbers can become inflated. But sometimes they really do hit another gear. And I think defensemen do that most of the time. I think that's why somebody like Sandin Pellikka is not taken high. You notice these top offensive defensemen, they're just not as appealing to NHL players because if they don't develop their defensive game, they're not going to be played by the coach anyway. This is why I have a problem with people being surprised about Tony DeAngelo and being surprised about Ghost. You guys didn't know they weren't great at D? This is what they are. They're offensive defensemen. That's not what this kid is. This is a two-way defender with the ability to develop his game into something more. I say it all the time. I said it with Cutter Gauthier. It's why I believed him being a top prospect. Look at the mold that you were getting. You were almost never getting a finished project. Even Michkov is not finished, and we will develop him into a franchise player. It's franchise potential. Plenty of players have not hit potential. It's always potential. But welcome to the Flyers, Oliver Bonk. I think it was a good pick. I would have been in favor more of a forward, but I don't think we're going to be complaining about it. And next year, the Flyers still have 2 first-round picks and expect them probably to take a top center, especially if they're one of the worst teams in the league. There will be star players available. So, again, welcome to the team, Oliver Bonk. Looking forward to see more of him, and we'll have more updates on the podcast. I'm excited.